those are all props, and really the way it begins is a bit like Bill Peach on CDT. I've got this bag here and I've got my various props in it. And what those are all about is that one of my earliest childhood memories is the smell of methylated spirits. It didn't come from the hardware store down the main road. Rather, it came from the bagman who used to sleep in the shelter sheds around the school when I was a boy. And what they'd do was this. They'd take some of that, which was called White Lady, methylated spirits in the approved old triangular bottle. Took me a long while to find a triangular bottle today, by the way. I put them in little squat bottles now. And I took some of the famous fourpenny dark from the local wine shop. And they got a tin of boot polish, and they took a spoonful of that, and they put it in there, and they mixed all that up, and they drank it. And it was a moment of instant oblivion for all those men on the track who could bring themselves to drink it, who were hungry and cold and wet and distressed and despairing, quite understandably in those days. I personally don't intend to drink that at all myself, although I'm quite prepared to give the recipe free of charge to Graham Kerr for his cookery session. These days we're pretty worried about unemployment, and quite rightly. It's running at about 4%, and that means a lot of men out of work. And nobody wants men out of work. But let's get that in perspective. The time I'm talking about, 1929, the beginning of the Depression, or even more so, 2 or 3 years later, say the depths of the Depression, 1931 or 1932, there were 300,000 men out of work in this country. And that was about 1 in 3 of the whole of the workforce. It's a bit like if all you people sliced yourself off in this theatre, and there you are, like that. And you're all out of work in 1929, and you don't get another job till 1933 or 34 or 35, or maybe even until you join the army in 1939. Now, I didn't really begin to ask very many questions about that in those days. I was too young. I was only 7 when the Depression broke out in 1929. So you don't ask very many questions at the age of 7. But you can't really escape the experience. These days, I'm a teacher of history. I wouldn't for a moment claim that I am impartial or unbiased. I don't believe that any teachers of history are impartial or unbiased. I believe that the only thing that a teacher of history can do is to tell his students or his readers right at the beginning what his biases and his prejudices are, and let them take it from there. And that's what I do every year. When I start, I tell my students much the same kinds of things that I'm telling you now, what my past has been, and the way in which that has biased the way that I see the world, the prejudices that I have, that I can't escape from, and let them make the necessary allowances. Fair enough. They were hard times. We'd just lived through the Depression. In fact, we weren't really through it completely then, because even as late as 1939, there was still something like 8 or 9% of the workforce out of work. But we'd been through the worst of it. We'd watched Hitler coming to power in Germany. We'd seen the obscenities of Streicher and Himmler moving into the destruction of the German Jewish population. And above all, we'd been emotionally wrapped up in the Spanish Civil War, which was the same kind of moral touchstone for my generation that Vietnam was for my children's generation. There were only 2 sides in Spain. There were the goodies and the baddies. It was many years later before I came to grips with the sort of internal politics of Spain, before I came to understand what all the complexities of Spain were, what all the tragedies of Spain were. But at that time it was very simple, very straightforward. It was them and us, and it was really an intense moral question, just as Vietnam was later on. And so at that time I began to put it all together. And at that time I began to move through to a left-wing and radical position. It seemed the natural position for a thinking young man anxious to learn about the world to adopt. I hit Melbourne out of Geelong, a boy from the bush, late in 1939. And I got off the train up there at Spencer Street, and I walked up to the centre of the city, to the Melbourne Town Hall, and there in the lower Melbourne Town Hall, down in the basement, was the Herald exhibition of modern British and American painting. And that was an extraordinary experience. Some of you probably went to the Museum of Modern Art, Modern Masters exhibition that's just been on. That had about 125 or 130 pictures in it. Down there in the basement of the Melbourne Town Hall in October or November of 1939, there were 200 pictures by those same painters. There were about, not 5 Picassos, there were about 9 Picassos. Not 1 Van Gogh, there were about 7 Van Goghs. Not 2 Gauguins, there were about 6 or 8 Gauguins. 10 Matisse and so on. An extraordinary experience. It was, all of a sudden, there it was. Wow. It was seeing the world through totally new eyes. Tremendously exciting. It's quite impossible to recreate it. I can't now, because it's too long ago, remember very many of the individual pictures. One of them I can remember was a picture by the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. It was called The Flower Man. It was a picture of a curious human torso tucked away in the top corner of a human pelvis. And the human torso was a bearded man with blood streaming out of his eyes and 1 female breast. And over in the top right-hand side there was a picture of 2 skeletal people embracing, and down on the bottom, typical of Dali, there was a large safe full of watches. I don't know what the watches had to do with the picture at all. It was called The Flower Man, L'Homme Fleur. And over it, Dali had scrawled a whole lot of graffiti. This picture caused enormous outrage to respectable Melbourne society at the time. Lionel Lindsay, who was one of Melbourne's leading art critics in those days, wrote a book denouncing the whole exhibition as a sort of a plant. It was all organised by a whole conspiracy of Jewish art dealers sitting over there in Paris, ripping off the Goyim, ripping off the Christians for their money by flogging to them these pictures by Picasso and all these bums who couldn't paint. And in the back of this book called Adult Art, Lionel Lindsay commented on the graffiti in Dali's picture. Le grand masturbateur. That is sufficiently clear. Guillaume Tell puzzled me for a long time. I thought of possible relationships in the opera. Suddenly, the simple story of William Tell shooting the apple from his child's head gave me the Freudian solution. To Freud's dirty mind, everything that penetrates, piston rod, knife, cork, walking stick, dart, is a symbolic penis, and the arrow piercing the apple becomes, in sullying a fine story, a common denominator of copulation. Respectable Melbourne was outraged. Anarchism and Bolshevism were loose in the art galleries of the nation. So far as I was concerned, beauty, that's just exactly what I wanted to see happen. You know, if we'd had Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister in those days and Jim Mollison running an Australian National Gallery, we probably could have bought the bloody lot of the pictures for almost nothing, and think how great that would have been if we would have had it around there now. They were interesting times in Melbourne. It was, in a way, a much more manageable city then than it is today. It was much smaller. Didn't have all those sprawling eastern and western suburbs. The university itself was a nice, tiny place almost. These days it's got 12,000, 15,000 students, Melbourne. So's Monash. In those days it had about 3,000 students, and you could know virtually everybody that there was on the campus. I lived in college, Ormond College. I'd been through all the inanities of the Ormond College initiation service, in which we spent a month learning the rituals of the college, and the last night walking around the tiers of the college, its 3 stories, naked, with holding candles and singing, "Did you ever think as the hearse rolled by that one of these days maybe you or I will be following along the same dark track with never a thought of looking back," and so on. I never knew what happened to those initiation ceremonies. I think they disappeared somewhere in the post-war period. I was actually enrolled for a law course. I wasn't terribly interested in law. I was much more interested in the avant-garde, in politics and in painting and so on. I was pretty broke in those days. I used to work in Myers' shirt department to make an extra bob. And in Myers' shirt department I met a bloke called John Sinclair, who these days is the music critic for the Melbourne Herald. And through John Sinclair I met his friend Sid Nolan, and through Sid Nolan I met his friends Max Harris and John Reed, who were just beginning to start Angry Penguins rolling, which was the big avant-garde thing in literature and the arts at those times. And we used to go to the studios around the place, Sid Nolan's first exhibition, which was held over a disused, in fact condemned, greengrocer's shop in Russell Street. Contemporary art society shows, Arthur Boyd's shows, all the kinds of shows that were going on around Melbourne at those times. Much more interesting than spending your time, or as I thought in those days, wasting your time trying to learn about the law. In fact, I remember as one of the first great shows that I ever saw of the work of Australian painters in this city, a contemporary art show which was held in the upstairs gallery at the Australia Hotel in Collins Street, then quite a new, young place, in October of 1941. That's the catalogue. Somehow or other it survived the last 34 years. And look at that catalogue today. Danila Vasiliev, a street in Fitzroy, 25 guineas. William Dobell, the Duchess Disrobes, 10 guineas. Sidney Nolan, Luna Park. How about that, Luna Park? 10 guineas. Albert Tucker, Spring in Fitzroy, 30 guineas. Bert was on the top of the market in those days. There it was. All those lovely paintings. And what was my pocket money? 5 shillings a week plus what I picked up out of my shirt department. You know, I would really have loved to have bought those paintings. And there, in the first floor gallery at the Australia Hotel in Melbourne, was probably what became the other great cultural influence for young, radical Melbourne students in those years in the early 1940s, and that was the sound of jazz. I'd heard a bit of jazz. I'd listened to Louis Armstrong playing Jeepers Creepers. I'd heard Ella Fitzgerald with the Chick Webb Band singing Rocket for Me and things like that over the radio, but I hadn't actually heard any live jazz until there it all was. It was all happening in the Australia Hotel in 1941. Graham Bell and his jazz gang will present a recital of hot jazz music. The band will improvise on the following tunes: Muskrat Ramble, Chinatown, Shimmy Like My Sister Kate, and Georgia Camp. And then in around about, I suppose, the same time as I was listening to Aid and Graham playing and looking at those pictures, I got from the Australian Army a call-up notice saying that I had to present myself to be inducted into the Army. So I fronted at the local induction office and I explained to not the recruiting officer because I was being conscripted, but the officer in charge, that I didn't really want to swear an oath of allegiance to His Majesty the King. I didn't have any religious belief, and I'd prefer to take a statutory declaration or whatever you had to do if you didn't want to swear. But he said, no, there's no way about it. You've got to take the Bible in your right hand and you've got to swear the oath of allegiance. Later it turned out that the reason for this was because there was a very strong likelihood of, once you got into the army, somebody or other was going to shoot you. And if you got dead, then somebody had to bury you, and the only useful buriers around the army were people with clerical collars, so that you had to have some kind of religion. And like all the other atheists in the Australian Army during World War I was C of E for the duration. Or at least that's what my identity disc, which the soldiers rather more realistically called meat tickets, said, C of E. We were called up for service going in on 7th of December 1941, a fatal day. I hit Spencer Street Station at about 6:30 a.m. on the morning of 7 December 1941, very uncomfortable in a desperately ill-fitting uniform, with a hat that obviously needed a great deal of wearing in, boots that didn't fit and were terribly heavy, to be confronted by a large party of journalists who said, "Hello," very brightly, "the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor and you're in for the duration." And so indeed we were. So up we went to Banagilla. It's a cliche of military history that the generals in any one war are not fighting the war that's going on at the moment. They're fighting the war that they got their training in. The last war, or maybe even the war before that. And indeed, that's what happened when I went to Banagilla. Because so far as the generals were concerned, they were lagging a long way behind modern military technology. We didn't have any modern military technology in Australia in those years. In fact, we didn't even have very many rifles. And what the generals were doing was training us to fight the 1914-18 war. And what the 1914-18 war was all about was large numbers of men gathered together in great divisions, brigades and battalions of infantry and attacking the other side, and if they were lucky, driving ahead until they got right through to the enemy's capital and captured the capital and then forced the enemy to surrender. And that was a war of man to man, or rather thousands and thousands of men as against thousands and thousands of men. So the training we got was something like this. You have to imagine, I don't actually carry, unfortunately, a rifle and bayonet around with me. I traded that in 1945 when I got out of the army. So that you have to imagine that this object here, which actually is an umbrella, is a Mark III Lee Enfield .303 rifle with bayonet attached. It should go up that way. And actually it's considerably higher than that. That's the rifle to about there, and the bayonet comes up to round about there, fitting right into the shoulder joint. The bayonet's a piece of steel about 12, 14 inches long, and down both sides of that piece of steel are cut two grooves so that the blood can flow down it relatively easily. Now, you've got the bayonet on top of the rifle, and it all weighs about 12 or 15 pounds or something like that. And what you do is you then hold the bayonet and the rifle like that in that hand, and you put that hand on the parapet of the trench in which you're standing, and you heave yourself over, and you get down on your belly, and dragging the bayonet and rifle behind you like this, you crawl along in the general direction of the enemy. Now, provided you survive the machine gun fire, which once they invented the machine gun was coming at you like that, down a big sort of spray, provided you survived that, and provided you were able to cut and claw your way through the barbed wire, eventually you were able to get up on your feet and move directly towards the enemy in a position that was called the high port. The high port is like that. You're carrying your rifle and your bayonet like that, and you're marching steadily or running hastily, as the case may be, in the direction of the enemy, trying to dodge the bullets. And when you get close enough, you come down into what is called the on-guard position. That's like that. And being in the on-guard position, you then proceed to lunge and withdraw if you're going for the throat. Or if you're going for the belly, you proceed to lunge and withdraw in that direction. If by any unsporting chance your enemy also is equipped with a bayonet and is lunging at you at the same time, what you try and then do is to what is called parry by sweeping his bayonet out of the way, like that with your bayonet, and strike, coming round with the butt of your rifle, which has a large plate of very heavy brass embedded in it, trying to break your opponent's jaw, which effectively disables him if you succeed. The other great difficulty about bayonet fighting is that if you happen to miss and going a bit low, instead of striking the throat, you strike the rib cage, or again going a bit low, and instead of striking the belly, you strike the pelvis, you get your bayonet embedded in the bone, and it then becomes a little difficult to remove again. What you do then, you've worked all this out in advance, and you have carefully done what is called put one up the spout, which is have a bullet actually in the barrel, and had your rifle cocked And if, by chance, you get the bayonet stuck in either the ribcage or the pelvis, you then pull the trigger and the recoil withdraws the bayonet. Well, actually, that was the training which we went through when I first did Banagilla. I must say I wasn't a very good soldier. I believed in the war, but I wasn't a very good soldier, and I wasn't a very enthusiastic soldier, so that I was entirely happy to fight the war in that part of the armed forces to which it pleased the military gods to send me, and they sent me to drive trucks around the place and staff cars. I nearly killed a brigadier general once by having an accident with another car. And then I worked in army education for a long while, talking to the troops about politics and things. Actually, the most important thing that happened to me during the army probably was that I joined the Communist Party. Highly illegal. We had a group of 4 members of the Communist Party in my unit. There was 1 major, 1 staff sergeant, 1 corporal, and 1 private. I was the private. I'd just been demoted from the exalted rank of temporary acting lance corporal for insolence and insubordination. An illegal enterprise. We used to hold our meetings after dark in the unit chapel. After all, it was a sort of religious observance, wasn't it? We talked about the Red Army and how it was going and what we wanted to do in Australia after the war. And that sort of furthered the initial radical commitment that I'd come to during my school years. And then in 1945, the word went out that us ex-university students who'd been sort of ripped untimely out of the university and scooped up into the army late in 1941 or early in 1942 might be able to get what was called an accelerated discharge. And since I'd been sitting up in North Queensland on the Atherton Tablelands now for about 18 months, not seeing very much of the world, and the Atherton Tablelands wasn't really all that bright. I mean, the beer was very short indeed, and the women were almost non-existent. I mean, there wasn't very much you could do on the Atherton Tablelands in your day off. Since I was a bit bored of the whole army by that time, I applied for the accelerated discharge, and I got back to the university in 1945. Just at the beginning of that time when Melbourne University exploded with a whole inrush of ex-servicemen, many of whom, like me, brought back out of the army the dream of a new kind of Australia that might grow in the future. University then was a pretty exciting place. It grew very rapidly indeed. It was politically jumping. We were, really a very significant force, the communists around the university in the mid-1940s and the immediate post-war years. We had a party branch in the university that had about 120 members in it. We used to meet in secret. At least we thought we used to meet in secret, but in fact we didn't meet in secret at all because inadvertently we had recruited to the party branch an ASIO agent. He was a huge, tall ex-RAF bloke, Air Force bloke, with blue hair, who used to sell, red hair rather, and we used to call him Blue, who used to sell The Guardian dressed up in his RAAF raincoat outside Union House. He had joined the party branch at the university to spy on us on the instructions of intelligence. What happened to him was very interesting because during the course of his membership of the branch, we in fact converted him to communism so that he became a double agent and he used to tell us what was happening on the other side. At the same time as they were infiltrating us, we were also infiltrating them. We had our spies in the right-wing ex-service organisations around the university, which later came out and denounced them and blew the whole thing up and so on. And they tried to get their spies back into us. So it was a lovely game of sort of international warfare, much better than John le Carré or Len Dayton, much more exciting because we were right in the middle of it. I graduated at Melbourne in law and later on in arts. I wasn't particularly interested in being either a lawyer, which I thought had something to do with protecting property, and I didn't really want to protect people's property, I wanted to take it away from them. I wasn't particularly interested in getting into the bureaucracy of the education department either. I was a dedicated, avowed, and I think probably pretty well-disciplined communist. And what I wanted to do was to work full-time for socialism. And I did that for about 10 years. For a couple of years, I was the first national secretary of the peace movement formed just after the war. We campaigned against the American monopoly of the atom bomb. We organised one of the first big peace congress in Australia in the post-war years, at which the exhibition buildings in Melbourne, very big building indeed, was packed twice over with people who came to hear Hewlett Johnson, the Red Dean of Canterbury. We campaigned under very difficult circumstances. In fact, I gave the keynote address at the Melbourne Town Hall against Australian involvement in the war in Korea. At the same time, I was carrying out party work. I was selling newspapers outside Myers and Burke Street, the party paper, The Guardian. Selling newspapers, The Guardian, outside the Richmond railway station. I was living in Richmond in those days. I was soap boxing on the Yarra Bank. Try this one for size. Comrades and friends, the absolute desperation of the American imperialists is shown by their invasion of Korea. They will be repulsed by the determination of the Korean people to win liberty and a better life. Try that for size. In St Kilda Road, Brunswick, at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning with the trams roaring past. I don't know whether I even made my voice heard, let alone win any recruits for the cause. But those are the kinds of things that were a normal part of Communist Party life in those days. Meetings, selling papers, going to classes, pasting up posters, painting up slogans around the city and so on. We expected that as a normal part of the work that a dedicated communist did. And then in 1956, the bottom dropped out of the world, so far as I was concerned. That was the year in which Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev gave his secret report to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in which he revealed a little bit of the truth about what had happened in Russia in the years of Stalin. And all of a sudden, all the things that we had accepted as absolute truth for all those years of Communist Party membership were suddenly lies. And for 2 years, I fought out that battle inside the Communist Party, saying that we had to rethink our whole position, and not getting very far at all, because the party itself had a very big investment in maintaining its faith in the truth of the Soviet Union. And finally, in 1958, after all that period of fighting, I got thrown out. It was like being excommunicated if you're a Catholic. Now, for how long? 13 years, I'd been living in what was a great extended family of comrades and brothers. If you went to Brisbane or Sydney, or indeed to Colombo or London, there were always comrades there. There was always a bed, always a cafe to eat in, always a pub to drink in, always people that you could find, meet, who talked your language, who were your comrades and your friends. And all of a sudden it all went. Really, it was very much like what I imagined, although I've never been through that experience, it must be for a Catholic to get excommunicated from his church. Happily at that time I got picked up by some old friends, old mates who were in the academic life, and I came back into the university world, and I've been there ever since. One of the other things that I learnt out of this whole experience was to have a new interest in popular culture. And why did I develop a new interest in popular culture? Because once having decided that the working class didn't believe the way that I thought they ought to believe, then it seemed to become important to find out what they did believe. And among the many things that working class people in this country and this city have a very fervent belief in, or a great emotional investment in, is football. One of the ways that you define yourself, who you are as a human being in Melbourne, is by declaring what football team you barrack for. You can't go to school in Victoria, you can't go into a pub in Melbourne without being asked and virtually being forced to answer, unless you're really prepared to dig your toes in and say defiantly, I belong to the anti-football league. You can't really avoid saying what team you barrack for. Now, it's on the public record that in fact I barrack for the Tigers. Why football? Well, as I read Melbourne, and I've lived in this city virtually full-time since about 1940, as I read Melbourne, Melbourne is a very uptight kind of town. Australia's a pretty uptight culture, but Melbourne is a particularly uptight town. Melbourne's not a town where you get out in the streets and scream and shout and wave and laugh and cry. Melbourne is not a town which encourages the public expression of emotion. There's almost only one place in Melbourne where you can let yourself go, and that's on Saturday Arvo at the football. You can scream, you can yell, you can dance, you can roar, you can laugh, you can cry, anything you like. It all goes in the football, all goes at the football. And it's very interesting to see Melbourne behaving in that kind of way. I remember I was down at the Moorabbin ground once, a couple of years back, watching St Kilda play Richmond. It was into the fourth quarter, and St Kilda had been doing well, and Richmond was now pulling a bit ahead. And the umpire made what was rather a curious decision. And there was a young bloke there, early 30s, short back and sides, white shirt, can of Foster's, not quite right. Took it out of his mouth for long enough to address himself to the umpire. "You rotten, bloody, mongrel, commo, poofter bastard." Now, that told me more about the prejudices and social attitudes of Australia, and Melbourne in particular, in 2 seconds, than most things I'd observed in 2 years. Commos, poofters, mongrels, bastards, he'd got it all in. And happily, that night, he did not go home and beat his wife. Well, one of the other things. What am I today? Bob Santamaria's Newsweekly says, "A rose by any other name. Red tigers don't change their stripes." I don't think that he thought that I smelt particularly sweetly. Ted Hill's Marxist-Leninist publications, a degenerate petty bourgeois intellectual who's deserted the working class and betrayed the revolution. Maybe, or maybe, like I think I am, a man who's lived many lives and died one death, and who these days thinks that perhaps I've got a little bit more wisdom about my own capabilities and about the possibilities of radical change in our society. But since I'm an historian, perhaps that's something that I'd better let history decide.